there's a lot going on in this world, as you all know, and we would love to make this session as interactive as possible and as engaging as possible. So, you know, we can make this a nice dialogue. We're going to spend some time with introductions and maybe some Q&A on some basic things, and we want you to take away from this session some tangible things that you can apply to your business right away. So, without further ado, I would love my two fellow panelists to introduce themselves. I do have an administrative thing. We have a phone and we have a text message capability to address questions you might have. So you can text questions to the phone, and I guess we can answer them as appropriate. But I would love to have Charlie and Robert sort of give a few-minute overview of who they are. We have their background information in the program itself, but I would love for them to maybe go a little deeper and talk a little bit about your experiences relative to our topic today, Charlie.
Sure. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, and thanks for sitting here for the afternoon for an hour with us talking about breach response. Less than an hour, I've spent the past 5 or 6 years working in breach response with agencies from large Fortune 10 companies all the way down to small 5-10 person shops, helping them sort of respond to the incident in that sort of chaotic first 24 to 48 hours, helping them set sort of the goals and the plans, and then helping them achieve those over the next month or so after the breach. I have a master's degree in cybersecurity from George Mason, and I have certifications at CISSP, ISSMP. I'm a certified ethical hacker. If I'm honest with myself, I probably started hacking in the 6th grade when I found a computer at the high school across the street. So it's been sort of a lifelong passion for me, sort of going from the side of how can I make this thing do things that wasn't designed to do, to how can I stop people from trying to do things to this thing that it wasn't really designed to do.
And Charlie, just before we pass on to Robert, what does iDiscovery do? What's your focus? Where are some of your customers? And
sure. iDiscovery Solutions is a litigation consulting firm. We generally work with attorneys and work with attorneys to help them understand technology. So attorneys went to law school to learn about the law. They didn't go to learn about technology and cybersecurity. I went to school to learn about cybersecurity. So I come in and help attorneys when they're faced with clients who've had breaches. And I help them provide communications. I help them understand what happened. A lot of times attorneys and senior management and IT are all talking in the same room, but they're not talking to each other. They're saying one thing, and we basically come to you just said X, and I know what you meant, but no one else in this room understood that. And so we'll try to put in place a communication strategy between the different groups so that everybody's on the same page. It's a difficult time, generally speaking. There's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of concern and fear for the organization. Everyone, in every instance I've ever been involved in, everyone is very earnest and wants to do the best for the company, but it's hard getting everyone to be on the same page and make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. And that's one of the big things that IDS really specializes in.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert Mayer. And I'm hoping that this does become more of a discussion, because I think this is an area where we can learn from each other, and I don't want it to just be one way. But let me tell you a little bit about my organization. The U.S. Telecom Association represents the largest Tier 1 global carriers in the United States, including AT&T, Verizon, CenturyLink, soon to be CenturyLink Level 3. We have about 7 mid-sized carriers, but in any other sector, those mid-sized carriers would probably be considered very large entities. And then we have close to 100 small companies with range which have tremendous range in their capabilities, from organizations with as few as 20 members to small companies with several hundred. And their capabilities in the area of cybersecurity vary tremendously. I'm also the chairman of the Communication Sector Coordinating Council, which is one of 16 critical infrastructure sectors that were set up through a presidential policy directive and executive order. Communication sector has 5 segments: broadcast, cable, satellite, wireless, and wireline in our coordinating council. We have close to 50 covers all of the major associations, and then some of the larger mid-sized entities that support those segments. And then finally, I've worked with the group to co-chair what's called the Multi-Association Framework Development Initiative, which is about 33 trade associations that are focuses on evolving in this cybersecurity framework, and we've been very much involved in discussions with this and other government partners on the next iteration. What I will share with you will be some anecdotal information. There's a whole issue around revealing information about breaches, as I'm sure you're well aware of. In some instances, I hope we get a chance to talk about some of the breaches that have occurred or security incidents where the Federal Trade Commission has either arrived at a settlement or pursued litigation. Mostly they settled quickly, but a lot of companies were named in various breaches, and I think from a CEO perspective, I'm going to be meeting with our board next week, and I'm going to share with them one document, and I'm going to say, if you read anything, read this document called Start with Security, because essentially it puts industry on notice, every business, as to if you're not taking these precautions, you're setting yourself up for liability. So with that, I'll turn it back to the moderator.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Robert. So, a question for the audience. How many of you are involved in a small business enterprise where you are either in a capacity of running IT or the CEO? So, we have a few of you. And how many of you have, in the audience, have experienced a breach of some kind that you are aware of? So, nobody. In preparation for this phone call, we talked about complacency and how there's this sort of it can't happen to me sort of feeling because it's happening to Target and Yahoo and big companies. But I wanted to go back to Robert to kick things off. You gave your bosses a document which talks about a couple of precautions. You want to highlight a few for us? Because I think that's completely applicable to large and small enterprises.
Sure, just in case I can't remember them all, but the document identifies 10 areas where the FTC has actually found companies negligent. The word that I would use in the context, I'm sorry.
Oh, hold the mic closer.
Oh, sure. There we go. Okay. Rather than say negligent, let me put it this way: the Federal Trade Commission generally will use what lawyers describe as the reasonableness standard, and they found organizations had not did not act in reasonable ways and held them accountable. And you have to understand that what's happening right now is that what was a reasonable action or protection 3 years ago or what may have been questioned of whether or not it was reasonable. Today, the bar is rising. So to meet the reasonableness level, you have to show more and more evidence that you're taking certain actions that cut across your organization, but also go to your third-party relationships, that go to your employees and the devices they have and where they use those devices, that go to the information that you make available to your customers, to your employees, to your suppliers. And so going specifically to the question, the document from the Federal Trade Commission talks about, and by the way, some of the companies that have been held accountable are names we all recognize, like BJ Wholesale Club, Twitter on several occasions, DSW, Fandango, Great Karma. There are probably about 40 companies that are listed in this document, but essentially controlling access to data sensibly. So when you hold data, I'm sorry.
It's hard to hear.
I'm sorry.
There's a lot of
that's right.
Yeah.
Yes. When you're holding data in your organization, there has to be a question as to why are we holding this data, how long are we holding it, who has access to the data, how are we disposing of the data, do we really need this data? And in this instance, the FTC found that a lot of organizations don't ask those questions. And they basically put people on notice that you have to deal with data in the way, certainly information that includes personally identifiable information, financial information, health information. You have to deal with that as you would deal with the most precious belongings in your house. That's one set of inquiries that I think CEOs and organizations have to make. Requiring secure password and authentication. That's an example where I think the reasonableness standard is getting higher. The bar for meeting reasonableness is increasing. If you have employees that are accessing your systems and they're using passwords that can be obtained through what's called brute force, basically machines that are running hundreds of thousands of guesses a second, then you're going to be held accountable. And in some instances, two-factor authentication is an expectation for securing access to various data. How you store personal information and how you protect it both in storage, data in storage, and data in transit. And some of these organizations fail to encrypt their data, and they left data in clear text. So you combine a lack of authentication and poor passwords with the failure to encrypt, and it's a recipe for information to be stolen from your organization. From your internal networks, the whole notion of segmenting the networks, the notion that somehow, as was the case with one vendor where somebody had broken into one of the stores, one of their in-store locations, because the networks were not segmented, that gave them immediate access to all of the other stores in that company, in that corporation, as well as to the networks, the network systems. They didn't segment. They didn't think about why this system doesn't necessarily have to connect with this other system. Remote access to your network with bring your own devices and the need for interconnecting with your suppliers and your customers, the whole issue of the protections you take around remote access and the expectations around that in terms of, again, access privileges. Does everybody need to have remote access? If they have remote access, are they going through a VPN with the appropriate protections and authentication? If you're releasing new products, companies have been held accountable for releasing products that didn't have the appropriate security by design in them. So increasingly, regulators and insurance companies are looking for organizations to make evaluations about their products before they release it to the market. And I have some anecdotes that I'll share with you later. And then there's some other ones here about make sure your service providers implement reasonable security measures, which means that if you're doing business with an outside third party and you don't make inquiries about their security precautions, you're going to be held responsible for that. So you cannot assign risk without assuming any responsibility for that risk. Then there's putting procedures in place to keep your security current and address vulnerabilities, which is basically saying there are known knowns, there are things that are out there that you not only should know, but if you don't know and you don't make an effort to find out about those, and you are in a situation where you become vulnerable, you're going to be held accountable. Having people who make queries about some of the more common attacks and how they can impact your business is something that's very important. And then even in the cyber realm, they're talking about securing physical media and devices. So there are examples of companies that leave computers on. They don't close out their programs at night. So maintenance workers can come in and start collecting information which can be used in some cases for subsequent phishing exercises. So there's a panoply of potential threats, and the expectation, I think, now more and more is that whether you're a medium or small business, and certainly whether you're a large business, if you're not taking the basic precautions that have been identified, you're leaving yourself vulnerable to liability.
That was great, Robert. Thank you for sharing. Charlie?
I just want to
absolutely.
sort of piggyback on something he just said, because as you were going through reading those things, I have this client that I worked with about a year ago, and pretty much everything you listed they didn't do. So it started with they had an old system that they had decommissioned, and they left it up and running. So they didn't ask themselves, why do we have this data? What's it doing? Why? And literally, they left it in a live state. They didn't just, you can just shut the server off and stick it in a closet somewhere, and you've still got the data if you ever need it. But they just left it up and running and live. They also had remote access to it, direct, no VPN, nothing to block anybody from getting to it. Attackers got onto it, had weak passwords for the system administrator account, which was also a domain administrator account. So once they got onto this system as administrator, they had domain access, admin access to the entire network, to every other server. They then, rather than really realizing what they had access to, just deployed ransomware all over the place, destroyed everything, pretty much got rid of all of the company's actual IT assets that were on site, including their backups. They found the backup server and wiped all the backups. So one of the best defenses against ransomware, backups. But you can't have the backup sitting next to the data that you're backing up, because then once the ransomware hits, it gets that too. When we came in to assist with this, we also found out, by the way, all of your database servers are currently undergoing brute force attacks. Did you know that? They're just constant in your logs. If you would just look at your logs, just when I put it up, I just noticed deny, just constant. So pretty much everything you just listed, any one of those steps, if they'd done it, would have possibly averted this disaster that they went through.
So they had the problem, suffered the consequences, and then had to pay, I'm sure, your organization good money to help them remediate and create new processes and deploy new tools.
Yeah.
And a lot of what you're describing is just kind of cyber 101, right? And if you don't have that resource in your organization right now internally, I think there's good reason to go find where there are resources who can help, at least with those basic evaluations. And the document that I was referring to indicates where you're describing a very obvious way of detecting that the systems were penetrated through the logs. In some instances, the FTC found that companies had not bothered to look through that, go through those logs to see those attacks, and they held them responsible.
And it would not have been that expensive to implement any of the solutions. They're all fairly simple, fairly quick things that an organization can do, most likely with existing IT staff and guidance from an expert.
So from a small business perspective, Charlie, how do I get started? Let's say Robert's List, we're doing half of the stuff great, half of it we're not doing so well with. How do you go about prioritizing? How do you figure out what because you have limited resources, limited time, limited money, and I know that you want to put locks on every single door window, but how do you go about the calculus of prioritizing what's important?
I think it's as we discussed in the prior session, in that inventory, who our people are, what their roles are in the organization, what they should have access to. So just like we segregate our networks, like Robert was saying, we can also segregate our employees and say, this is a person who's in HR, they should have access to the health information and benefits information for all of our employees. This is another person who's an administrative assistant, they probably should not have access. So we can do some role-based and look at our employees. And if we're a smaller business, we probably don't have thousands of employees. We've got dozens of employees that we can look at and we can sort of assess what they should be having access to. We can assess our systems. We can say these are the data points that we have. And then I think one of the critical things that we should think about is, when does data leave our organization? And that you might think of that as I send an email out and that's data leaving my organization. But also think about that as, my employee has a laptop and they walk out of this office every night with their laptop, and that's got data on it. And they sit down at Starbucks and they get up to go to the bathroom and they come back and that laptop's gone. what does that mean to me? And one of the really quick things you can do to help with that is put encryption on the laptop. And one of the recent stats I'm trying to remember right now is a unencrypted laptop lost is about a $50,000 event for an organization. An encrypted laptop lost is about a $5,000 event for an organization, including the cost of the laptop. So we very simply, most modern versions of Windows, you can get BitLocker on and encrypt it. If you can tell, I don't care what data was on there, the hard drive was encrypted, they can't get to it. I've lost a laptop, it's hardware, it's a small report, just basically saying this is what's going on, we have to repurchase or redeploy a new machine. It's not a, what information was on there, did I have client information on there, was there PII, was there PHI, is there anything else on there that I need to report or disclose? You basically stop that question at the front door.
Right. You know, I had a question on bring your own device. Do you guys all, who doesn't have a BYOD policy? So pretty much everybody in the room has a BYOD policy. You talked about encrypting, you know, laptops, company issued laptops, I guess, but you know, how does you want to balance sort of, you know, I want to bring a certain iPhone, let's say, or an Android device to work. It's great as an employer, commonplace, everyone's doing it now, right? And I can't, this isn't DoD where you're, you know, assigning the BlackBerry or whatever. Yeah, how do you balance sort of this need for security and encryption against employee privacy and freedom?
Well, I mean, I don't see that asking your employees if you're going to bring your laptop, having it encrypted makes any difference for their privacy, right? I mean, it's essentially you're helping them improve their privacy because you're helping them encrypt their laptop so if it gets lost, they have personal data on there. Their personal data is not lost. They don't have to worry about identity theft and things like that. You know, I would say any small business that has wireless Wi-Fi in their offices, whether you know it or not, you have a BYOD policy. And that is, I've got a Wi-Fi, I've given the password to my employees, they will connect their personal devices to it, unless you specifically tell them not to. So that might be something. You might say, hey, we've got a guest network. Your personal devices belong on the guest network, corporate devices belong on the corporate network. If you have a need, most people don't want to connect their iPhone to the corporate network to get the corporate assets. They just want the internet connection. They want to be able to get their email and do things like that. And the guest network works just as well for that as the corporate one does. But if you don't tell them, they'll want to use the corporate one because in their mind it's faster, it's better, it's more secure. And by doing that, they bring their device into it and it undermines that security.
But in your experience, gentlemen, you know, do you feel that a BYOD policy company is at more risk than a company that is more company-issued equipment? Or are the risks there no matter what?
I'm going to say the BYOD has more risk.
More risk. And what would you do to mitigate? Like, what are a couple things you would do to mitigate that risk?
Yeah, let me try to.
I know we've got a lot going on here.
So,
Sorry.
let's talk about where the problem started. Problem started, I would say, just around the time Apple came out with the iPhone. It really got problematic. And what happened was that CEOs and C-level executives in a lot of organizations got very comfortable with the iPad and the iPhone and went to their IT folks and said, yeah, I know there are all these kind of security risks, but I really don't care. This is the device I want to use. Because of the high level of interest at that level of an organization, quickly organizations had to respond, and then there was, there were BlackBerries. The BlackBerries had security capabilities in them that were a little bit more effective. But over time, I think the question is somewhat moot because I think now there is an expectation that BYOD is going to be, if it's not ubiquitous at 100%, it's just going to be more and more the norm. And I think because of that, I think security firms and apps and mobile devices and carriers are building security capabilities now more into their applications and their devices, so it becomes less problematic. It doesn't make the problem go away, and it certainly increases the risk. But in terms of the convenience of doing business, you know, when I started, the IT departments controlled everything. I worked at JP Morgan, and the IT was the kingdom. They controlled access to all systems, all protocols, and over time what happened was the business unit said, you know, screw this. I need an application that works for my business, and I'll talk about security with the vendor, and they started bypassing the centralized IT organizations. To the point where today, nobody would think twice about somebody in the line of business, C-level executive saying, we're going to use this CRM platform, or we're going to use this cloud service, or we're going to use infrastructure as a service. They just do it. So we've created more risk and exposure, but we've also created a lot of opportunity and revenues and made business easier. That's going to be the tension that's going to exist for a long time. And the people who, like the CEOs and the C-level folks who are driving the business, are going to have a tendency to lean towards making decisions that give you strategic advantage, it gets you first to market, that makes your employees more happy because they're bringing their iPad or they can use their iPhone. Those are the tensions. I think those worlds can be reconciled, but it's going to require a lot of diligence about what the security vulnerabilities are and what's
So Robert, I have an 80-employee company in Vernon, Virginia. We have over 40 subscriptions to as a service. It ranging from Box, Dropbox, Google Docs, Salesforce.com, 40 of those. What advice would you give a company like ours? Like, where do you start? You got employees that are going to the, you know, they're serving their customers. They're doing a great job with that. And we don't want to, as a business owner, I don't want to create friction for them, but I also don't want to be vulnerable.
Right.
So, how do I start?
I'm going to let Charlie.
I just wanted to interject before you said that you have these subscription as a service software packages. You gave a number, and I just want to tell you that's the number that you understand, but that's probably not the number.
Probably low, right?
That's probably much lower than what it really is.
That's scary.
That the ease of signing up and creating these services today and the low cost allows employees and department managers to do it on their own.
Right.
And move forward with arguably performing the business of the organization.
Right.
I mean, they see this as on their own devices, on their own cloud storage, setting up AWS.
Exactly.
You know, I have a client now who has an AWS problem in that his divisions are all setting up AWS clusters and setting up all kinds of services on them and providing them to their customers, and none of it's documented. Nobody knows what's going on, and then they have a problem. And all of a sudden the problem is a business problem, and yet there's no IT support for it because IT has no idea that these things exist. And in the past it was sort of this, hey, I got this iPhone, we're gonna make it work. You know, I'm old school, I go back and think, you know, when I was starting out it was, hey, we set this server up. You know, I got this server in the back closet in our department and we're running, you know, Lotus Notes or something like that, that's not sanctioned by the company. And you go forward a little bit, it was the wireless router, so they brought a wireless router in and set it up so we could have Wi-Fi. And they never secured it, so that was a wide open door. Now, you know, there was BYOD that we talked about. Now it's shifted to this shadow IT, which is...
BYO service.
Yeah, it's all these cloud services that we can sign up for. You know, you say Dropbox, and I say, that's great, you might have a corporate Dropbox, but guess what? I've got my Google Drive, and I sync all my documents to Google Drive also. And somebody else might have OneDrive. And Box and all these different storage devices that are personal / kind of corporate. It's got corporate data in it. That's the type of stuff that terrifies me when I think about how do we secure that. And when we say, just like what Robert was saying earlier, if we shut the door and I go, okay, you know what, we're just going to block Google Drive because we don't want people using it. They're going to shift to Box. We're going to block Box. They're going to shift to Dropbox. You know, the more things you try to like whack-a-mole, the more they're going to shift in another direction because they're trying to
serve the customer,
get business done. So from a security viewpoint, when we address something that, okay, people are using Google Drive, Instead of saying we need to block Google Drive because that's bad, we need to ask, why are people using Google Drive? What are they trying to achieve? And can we provide them with a secure solution that allows them to do the same thing and achieve the same result in a way that makes the company address the risk in a way that they feel is manageable? So I think it's limiting. It's what say, guys, we're gonna pick a cloud storage device or cloud storage package. The company's going to sanction it. We'd like you to use this, and making that policy. And I think for the most part, you'll find that once employees know that and they understand the risks and they understand why it's being done, they'll use it because it is going to solve their problem.
A lot of it's training and education, I guess, right?
Yes.
Situational
Yes.
awareness and things to look for. Does the audience have any input, commentary on what's been said so far? Yes.
So if somebody's using Dropbox, Sync, SpiderOak, whatever, and you want to replace that with something that you think is more secure, what would that be?
I think that's up to you as an organization to look at the different offerings that are out there, find out what is it that we're trying to achieve. Are we using this for backup purposes? Is this so that you know you've got a backup of your documents? Is it so that you know you get your documents at home? And understand rather than what the technical need is, what's the business need? Why are we doing this as a business? Do we have a better solution that the business can adopt? I think it would be different for most people. I don't think I can just say, you should use Google Drive because Google Drive is great because I use it. For your organization, Google Drive may be the wrong choice. For your organization, something else where you can get a truly corporate, encrypted, private box might be more appropriate. You might want to have controls around how that data is managed by the cloud. If that cloud provider receives something like a subpoena for documents, are they going to come to you first and say, hey, we received this third-party subpoena for your data. We don't think we can provide it. You need to respond. Or are they just simply going to provide that data in response? Those are the types of things that as a corporation you would be concerned about. Whereas as a person, I may never even think about it.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
Sorry, I'm sorry. You're next after Robert.
So the only thing I wanted to add was the situation that's being discussed here has been reviewed by the FTC, and where companies have made decisions about these third-party services, and it would have been easy to discover that there were security problems with this organization. You have a responsibility to understand what the vulnerabilities were there, what the history of it has been. If a company makes assurances to you about security, and you rely on those assurances without following up to make sure that they in fact have been implemented, you can also be held responsible now. So what's happening is more and more responsibility is being put on the users and the decision makers in those organizations to do what they can to address the kinds of considerations you've raised. But there's no easy answer here, because a lot of the decisions that employees make about these services fly completely under the radar. And management doesn't have time to check what every site they're using. I can use Doodle Poll, and I can use a free service and sign up for it, and nobody will ever check it out or know it. There are other services that you can do a trial on. You can subscribe to the service. In some cases, people put through the expenses for that. In some cases, they don't. Do the people who have responsibility for managing expenses say, well, that's an inappropriate exercise of a choice you made? In most cases, no. So you really have to know the best you can what outside services your employees are using, what they're using it for, what data they are providing into that service. We had a situation recently where we were using a shared Google Drive, and folks found out that a lot of the information in there was strategic communications affecting a large industry, and were horrified that that kind of information was just casually put on to an unprotected service like that, or forget about the possibility that Google itself might be having the ability to make certain determinations. So there's a whole different level of engagement that executives now have to make about what their employees and their organization are doing with respect to using these outside services. Thank you, Mark.
Yes, ma'am.
So I have a Martha Schoonmaker with Montgomery College. More of a workforce or employee question. Because as I sit and listen to all of the systems and the technology, the people who are using these, and I'm sitting here thinking about no indication on or indicted on our human resources, but I'm thinking about all the information that human resources has on me. I don't even know who these people are. And so when you look at corporations and companies, what are safety things or security clearance? Are the people who are doing all of this and working with this information? I mean, you heard this morning the keynote speaker, there were college kids up there hacking it's a person problem too.
Yeah, so one of the topics we learned about in my management master's class was the difference between tame problems and wicked problems. And in cybersecurity, the technical problems, for the most part, are tame and solvable. It's the people problems that keep getting themselves unsolved. We think we've solved this problem, but now we have new employees and they don't know how, or they haven't been educated, or they make a mistake. It's always the people who sort of undermine our security, and I think that's the hardest part to solve. I think of cybersecurity as sort of three pillars, and it's technology, people, and process. And the processes we can put in place, we can say this is how we do things. And the technology we can put in place, say we've got this technology, we've got these firewalls, we've got this antivirus, this is the way we do this. The people aspect is the most difficult and challenging one, as it always is. I mean, we're all individuals, we're all different, we all do our own things. And we don't always all think with sort of security in the forefront of our mind. We always think about, okay, I've got to get this done today, these are the things I need to achieve, and I may not pay attention as things are going on.
Are there standard risk mitigation techniques vis-a-vis this people risk thing?
I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is education. If you never tell your employees that this is a problem, they will never know or think about it. If you tell them, security is important to us, security is important to us, and you keep sort of drumming beating that drum, it'll start to sink in.
Don't click on that weird email.
Right.
Click on that.
That one there. So after the WannaCry thing comes out, right? I start getting a bunch of emails from companies like Symantec, IBM, who should know better, who sent me an unsolicited email saying, "Hey, click here to learn how to avoid ransomware." I'm like, you're the people. You're part of the problem. This is part of the problem, is that we do that. I could very easily take that exact same email, leave it exactly as it is, change that link, and send it out to a bunch of people. And yet, so even the people who should know better don't always know better, I guess is the lesson there.
And the bad guys get clever all the time, so now they know that people are learning about not clicking on emails, so they put the malware into the web browser, and if you click onto a web browser, you can have the same impact that if you open up an email. It does require a lot of training. I think Verizon in their 2017 report said that 30% of the breaches were associated with insider activity. Now, that's not all malicious. In many cases, it's just a sloppiness, a lack of education. But the human factor is a huge part of it. So I think some of the more advanced thinking that's happening in terms of artificial intelligence and machine learning now is to look at behavioral characteristics and heuristic analyses, so that what you start seeing is, wow, this really doesn't make sense that this person is looking at this file, or they've looked at something 10 times in 24 hours, and that doesn't fit the profile. So you create alerts around all of these human behaviors. Eventually, those products filter down into the small and medium business community, but they have to evolve very rapidly, and it requires large, big data to start making some understanding around that. We did some analysis on some of our members, and what we discovered was that there was a lot more that needed to be done in terms of onboarding people and getting them quickly trained and accustomed to the security protocols, and not kind of treat it as secondary or tertiary, and first we do health benefits and then we do what's in the office. That wasn't happening. There wasn't the exit interview process was not appropriate. And one of our members had said that we all have this image of people who are escorted out of a building when they're terminated, with a box of their belongings. And nobody understands that the real threat is that they're walking out with, a flash drive, or the night before they knew they were leaving, they downloaded everything from a shared drive, and then it gets discovered that the information is on the dark web, and it's retribution on the part of a disgruntled employee. So all of these things now have to be factored in. I think it can be overwhelming for a small business to think that we've got to do all of these activities. That's not going to happen. But understanding your employees, what their training requirements are, what privileges you give them in terms of accessing systems, how they treat their passwords, those are basic blocking and tackling things that can be done. In the case of the university, you're right. You have a lot of sophisticated young users who really want the bragging rights of hacking, and they're persistent. And I think every business understands that sooner or later, if you're persistent, you're using advanced persistent threats, they're going to get you. We've had some of the companies that I'm aware of who you would associate with the top security capabilities in the world. I mean, recently we've had Deloitte hacked. Their emails have been hacked. That's been reported. We've had Xchange this week reported. I mean, these are the guys who are telling everybody what to do, and they're being hacked. The problem is that the people who are attacking have the economic advantage. It doesn't nearly cost them as much to initiate the attack as it costs the company to defend against it, so the economics don't work, and they're persistent. So that's why we find that, for example, when you look at breaches, in some cases, they've been over a year and a half in your system, or they've been trying to get into your system. And you look at Target, you look at Equifax, you could say, well, we don't know that they started with this complaint resolution problem at Equifax. Maybe they were hitting 20 other systems for vulnerabilities and finally locked on the one where they could get the access. That's the world we're living in. These guys are very determined. They're looking for every vulnerability. And if you do it long enough and you have enough resources, you're going to find it.
Yes, sir.
So I just said one. So the school that my daughter goes to, speaking of students, is it's a K through 8th grade school. And I help them, they do a lot of technology learning, and so I kind of help them out with sort of the security aspects of it. When I first came to them, I said, you guys really should be worried about security, and the headmaster was like, oh, no, it's fine, don't worry about it, it's not a big deal, we've got a firewall, and so that's probably not good enough. About a week later, she called me back, she said, maybe we should have that conversation, because we just had this happen. We had one of the 7th graders set up a Gmail account in my name, and then email her teacher and tell her teacher that you suck, I hate you, you're fired, don't come to school tomorrow. And she said, the teacher, when she got it, obviously read it and was like, oh, well, that's, obviously not from the headmaster. But if it had been worded differently, if it had been something slightly different, like, hey, we're having a teacher work day tomorrow, would you mind coming by my office at 2 o'clock? That might have worked. Or any other sort of innocuous, if the student hadn't been the, I hate you, which is obviously a tip-off. And then we started talking about it, and what we came back to was all of their insiders are minors. They're all children, but they're all actively trying to do stuff. And one of the biggest holes that we found was their firewall, which was blocking all of these sites. The students had figured out how to use their cell phones, which obviously they all have now, as Wi-Fi routers, and connecting to their cell phones and completely bypassing all of the school's filters, all of their blocking, everything they were doing, all of their security was completely being bypassed, simply because the student had an iPhone and would click a button.
So you need certificates and things like that, right? There are things you can do to protect against that.
Yes, yeah. It never dawned on them.
Yeah, well,
It was.
It wouldn't. It wouldn't, but, yeah.
I think we had a, yes, sir.
I have a question. I come from an operations perspective rather than cybersecurity. Middle management there, but I think it's getting left out of the equation in terms of actually driving down cybersecurity throughout the entire organization.
Yeah, and I think that's, and I would even go the next, it really has to start at the top layer and be pushed down. I've sat in a boardroom with senior partners of a small firm explaining to them the breach that just happened. And obviously I must have probably said the wrong thing, and one of them slams the table and goes, "Are you telling me this is my fault?" and as he said it, I realized, yes, it is your fault. It is your fault. It's not your fault because of specific technology. It's your fault because you didn't instill that culture of security into your managers, who would then instill it into your employees. Because you sat here and asked that question. You asked the question, is it my fault? You're the leader of this organization. There's risk in your organization. That risk was taken advantage of by someone outside the organization. Whose fault is that? And so you're right, it's management, it's senior management down to middle management who has to sort of set that culture for the entire organization.
So I'm sure you've heard about the framework today, and probably before today. So you know that whole risk management approach that NIST created was designed to create that 360-degree kind of responsibility and an iterative process of engagement. So middle managers would be involved. But what's interesting about the CEO is a couple of things. I was at a discussion recently with the person who headed up cybersecurity for one of my largest members, who's now independent. And he said, we're coddling the CEOs in terms of our conversations about cybersecurity with them, because they say, well, this is all too difficult and I really don't understand this, and go talk to my IT guy, or talk to somebody else. And they don't really have the interest or the patience to really ask probative questions and get into the discussion. And his response was, from a financial perspective, these people ask every question about risk. What's happening in the market? What's our market share? What is our exposure internationally? What's the supply chain? What are our competitors paying? They ask every single question you can imagine that goes to protecting their financial interests. But when it comes to protecting information and cyber, they go blank. And they delegate it to somebody else in the organization. So the White House, when they issued the last executive order in May, said something very interesting. They said, look, we know we have issues in federal agencies and enterprises, but if you're the head of the agency, you're accountable. I mean, what they're trying to get to is say to the OPM executives, you guys were clueless, you had other agencies involved in your network security, you didn't hold people responsible for making sure even the most basic systems were in place. You do a checklist, compliance, check out the box for FISMA. That's not enough. They're basically saying if there's a problem, you're the point person on it. That's increasingly happened. I don't know how long the Equifax person lasted, but once they got rid of the music major, I think then they got rid of the CEO. And that's more common now. So CEOs really are on notice that you have to infuse that security culture into middle management. And they need to talk to each other, and then when they have conversations with other departments in the organization, because they procure services across these departments, there has to be a conversation of how are you handling security? You know, have you been exposed before? What did you learn from it? So you start building a culture that starts making a real, genuine inquiry into it. Until we do that, you know, there's just going to be more and more instances of breaches. And I just want to say one thing, if I may, just anecdotally. We had a company, a small company recently, maybe I think 120 employees. And they were attacked on the enterprise side. And they have an IT department, and they were re-imaging computers and doing everything by the textbook to try to get rid of the problem, and the problem just resurfaced. Malware kept on showing up, and they thought at some point it was, a nation-state kind of attack. We made an arrangement for them to speak to the top technologists in the largest company that we have. These are people who sell cybersecurity services to the alphabet agencies. They're the best in the business. And as this small company IT person was talking about the indicators of compromise that were affecting their organization, the head of the cyber group in this company had one word and said, "Wow, we had no idea that this sophistication and this capability was now affecting small companies," because those are their customers of this larger company. And they had to do what you described, where they had to bring in experts. For 1 week, it was six figures, multiple six figures, to address the problem. And they came up with 180 areas where this organization needed to implement controls that were not in place, and they thought they weren't in place. So you can either do it before the event, or you can do it after the event. But the events are going to happen, and the small and medium businesses are targets, because today you can generate attacks through machines. They're indiscriminate. The ransomware that's going out right now is translatable into 30 different languages. You can buy it on the dark web very easily. There's no cost to send it out to 100,000 companies. Companies that don't patch, have existing software that's no longer operable, which is the case with what happened with the WannaCry situation. And Petya also, where you're in place. So these are things that you just, these are no longer discretionary activities, they're requirements. Unfortunately, that's the world we live in.
That's absolutely a great point, and I think we're out of time. Hopefully Robert and Charlie will stick around, but I think the takeaway for me as a business leader is that these threats aren't going anywhere anytime soon. It's persistent. We have to be completely vigilant, and it's incumbent on management as the bar gets raised to make sure that we, the leaders of an organization, are on top of the situation and making sure that our people, not just our process and our technology, but that our people are as educated as possible. But please join me in thanking Charlie and Robert. Thank you guys. We'll see you guys later.